It is the evening of May the 6th, 1937. A giant is coming home from the sky, 804 feet of silver, longer than 3 Boeing 747s laid nose to tail. Very nearly the length of the Titanic, is drifting down toward a field in New Jersey, its 4 engines murmuring, its great silver hull catching the last gray light of a stormy afternoon. This is the Hindenburg. It is the largest flying machine ever built by human hands. And aboard it, 97 people are gathering their coats and pressing to the windows after 3 days crossing the Atlantic in the most luxurious way the world has ever known. They are about to land. On the ground, a crowd waits. Reporters, newsreel cameras, a radio man named Herbert Morrison, recording a calm, almost bored description of a routine arrival for a station back in Chicago. The mooring lines drop from the nose. The ground crew reaches up to take them. It is 7:25 in the evening. Everything is ordinary. Everything is fine. And then, near the tail of the great ship, something begins to glow. In the next 32 seconds, less time than it has taken me to say these words, that giant becomes a fireball. 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen ignites, and the entire ship is consumed, falling burning to the earth with dozens of people still inside it. Herbert Morrison's calm voice cracks into the most famous broadcast in radio history. Oh, humanity! This is the Hindenburg Disaster. It killed 36 people, but it did something stranger and larger than that, too. It was the first great catastrophe of the modern age to be captured on film, on photograph, and on sound all at once, and beamed into living rooms around the world within hours. And in those 32 seconds, it did not just destroy an airship. It killed an entire idea of how humanity would conquer the sky. This is the story of the most luxurious way anyone has ever traveled, the fatal compromise hidden inside it, and the half-minute that ended an age. To understand how it burned, you first have to understand how magnificent it was. To anyone alive today, the idea sounds almost absurd that the future of travel was once thought to belong not to the airplane, but to the airship, the floating giant, the flying ocean liner. And yet for a brief, puff, glittering span in the 1930s, that is exactly what the world believed. Because in the 1930s, the airplane was still cramped, deafening, dangerous, and short-ranged. No airplane could carry you across the Atlantic Ocean. None. If you wanted to cross from Europe to America, you took a ship, and you spent 4, 5, 6 days at sea. The airship offered something miraculous. It could make that same crossing in half the time, gliding smoothly above the waves. And it could do it in a style that makes a modern first-class cabin look cramped. These were the German Zeppelins, named for Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, the man who pioneered them. And by the mid-1930s, the German Zeppelin Company had achieved something genuinely astonishing. Over more than 30 years of commercial passenger service, their airships had carried tens of thousands of passengers more than 1 million miles across oceans and continents on more than 2,000 flights without a single passenger injury. Not one. By the safety record of the day, the airship was the safest way to fly that had ever existed. That record is part of what makes what is coming so devastating. And to feel the grip the airship held on the world's imagination, you have to know where it came from. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin was a German cavalry officer who became obsessed, late in life, with the idea of rigid airships, and flew his first one in the year 1900. First, the world laughed at the old Count and his enormous cigars of the sky. They stopped laughing in the First World War, when German military Zeppelins droned across the North Sea in the dead of night and dropped bombs on London. For the first time in history, war came from the air to civilians far behind the lines. The Zeppelin was, briefly, one of the most feared weapons on Earth. People learned to look up at the sound of engines in the dark with genuine dread. After that war, Germany turned the airship from a weapon back into a wonder. The company built the Graf Zeppelin, and in 1929 it did something that stunned the planet. It flew all the way around the world, circling the entire globe in just over 3 weeks, carrying passengers in comfort the whole way. The Graf Zeppelin went on to fly for 9 years and over 1 million miles without hurting a soul. By the time the Hindenburg took to the air, the German Zeppelin was not a gamble or an experiment. It was a proven, prestigious, almost romantic way to travel, the Concorde of its day, only grander, which is exactly why the world was so utterly unprepared for what it was about to see. And the flagship of this floating empire, the grandest of them all, was the LZ-129, the Hindenburg. Named after a former German president, she first flew in 1936, and she was designed to be nothing less than a palace of the air. Picture what it was actually like to travel aboard her. You did not sit strapped into a narrow seat. You strolled, promenades running down both sides of the ship, lined with great slanted windows that you could open to the wind. Looking down on the ocean 1,000 feet below, there was a dining room with white tablecloths, fine china, proper meals served by stewards. There were private cabins with beds. There was a writing room and a lounge with a lightweight aluminum grand piano. And, this is the detail people never believe, there was a smoking room, pressurized, sealed smoking room, with a single electric lighter, aboard a ship held aloft by 7 million cubic feet of the most flammable gas on Earth. Hold that thought, because it is the heart of the entire tragedy. To understand why the Hindenburg burned, you have to understand the gas that filled her, and the desperate compromise her builders were forced to make. So let me take you inside the machine itself. Hindenburg was a rigid airship, and that word, rigid, matters. She was not a floppy balloon. She had a skeleton, an enormous, intricate framework of a light metal alloy called duralumin, fabric of girders and rings, running the entire 800-foot length of the ship, giving her a fixed, permanent shape. Over that skeleton was stretched an outer skin of tightly doped cotton fabric, painted and treated to be smooth and weatherproof. From the outside, she looked like a single seamless silver torpedo, but the skin was just a shell. Inside that rigid frame, suspended like enormous balloons within the skeleton, were 16 vast gas cells. These were the lungs of the ship, and they held the gas that made her lighter than air. Beneath and within the hull were the decks where the passengers lived. The crew worked. Control car hung below the nose, like the bridge of a ship, and 4 powerful diesel engines in pods along the sides drove her forward at up to around 80 miles an hour. She could carry between 50 and 70 passengers in that first-class splendor, along with a crew of around 60, plus mail and freight, clean across the Atlantic. She was, by any measure, one of the supreme engineering achievements of her age, a machine the length of an ocean liner that floated as gently as a cloud. But everything about that miracle depended on one single question. Gas do you put inside those 16 great cells to lift her? And the answer to that question is the reason 36 people died. There are 2 gases light enough to lift a ship like the Hindenburg. The first is helium. Helium is wonderful for one overwhelming reason. It does not burn. It is completely inert. You can hold a flame to helium, and nothing happens. If the Hindenburg had been filled with helium, the disaster you are about to witness could not physically have occurred. But helium has 2 problems. It provides slightly less lift than the alternative. And far more importantly, in the 1930s, there was effectively only one place on Earth that produced helium in any quantity, the United States of America. The second gas is hydrogen. Hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe. It gives superb lift, and it is cheap, and it can be produced almost anywhere. Hydrogen has exactly one flaw. It is ferociously, violently flammable. Smallest spark, in the presence of leaking hydrogen and air, can set off a fire that spreads faster than the eye can follow. Now here is the cruel part, the decision at the center of everything. The German engineers were not reckless men. They knew the dangers of hydrogen intimately, and so they had actually designed the Hindenburg to use helium, the safe gas. Their entire plan depended on buying helium from the United States. But the United States had passed a law, the Helium Control Act of 1927, restricting the export of this strategic gas. And by the mid-1930s, with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party now in power in Germany and the world growing uneasy, the American government refused to sell. The board that controlled helium exports would not grant the license. The Germans pleaded. The Americans said no. And so the builders of the Hindenburg were left with a terrible choice: abandon the great ship or fill her instead with hydrogen, the flammable gas. the cheap, dangerous, beautiful gas. They chose hydrogen. They had little real alternative if the ship was to fly at all, and they comforted themselves unreasonably with that spotless 30-year safety record. The German Zeppelins had flown on hydrogen for decades without losing a single passenger. They had procedures. They had discipline. They believed they had tamed it for years. They were right. And then, on one wet evening in New Jersey, they were catastrophically, fatally wrong. There is one more thing you must understand about the Hindenburg, because it hangs over the whole story like the storm clouds that gathered over Lakehurst that day. By 1937, the Hindenburg was not merely a passenger liner. She was a symbol, a flying symbol of the new Nazi Germany. On her vast tail fins, painted huge and red and black, were swastikas. The German propaganda ministry, under Joseph Goebbels, understood exactly what this enormous, gleaming ship represented. Technological might and ambition of the Third Reich, sailing serenely over the cities of the world, for everyone to look up and see. The Hindenburg was an instrument of national pride and of political theater. And that is part of why, when she fell, the whole world was watching, and why the cameras were already rolling. On the 3rd of May, 1937, the Hindenburg lifted off from Frankfurt, Germany, bound for Lakehurst, New Jersey, the first North Atlantic crossing of her second season of service. Aboard were 36 passengers and 61 crew and trainees, 97 souls in all. In command was Captain Max Pruss, a veteran airshipman who had flown Zeppelins since the First World War. Also aboard was Captain Ernst Lehmann, one of the most experienced and respected airship commanders in the world, traveling as a senior observer. These were not amateurs. They were among the finest airmen alive. The passengers were a cross-section of the privileged world of 1937, business travelers, a few wealthy tourists, returning Germans, an advertising executive, 14-year-old cabin boy among the crew. They paid a fortune for their tickets, the equivalent of many thousands of dollars today, for the privilege of crossing the ocean in 3 days instead of 6, comfort no airplane could dream of offering. For 2.5 days, the crossing was everything the Hindenburg promised. Smooth, silent, magnificent. Passengers dined and wrote letters and stood at the open promenade windows, watching the gray Atlantic slide by far below. Life aboard followed a gentle rhythm that no airplane has ever matched. There was almost no engine noise in the passenger spaces, no vibration, no sense of speed, just the soft hiss of the wind and the slow turning of the world below. Passengers woke in real beds, were served hot breakfasts on monogrammed china, wrote letters on Hindenburg stationery that would be postmarked from the air, and gathered at the slanting promenade windows to watch icebergs, ocean liners, finally, the coastline of a new continent, drift past beneath their feet. In the evenings, they sat in the lounge while a crewman played that featherweight aluminum piano. And a few of them, against every instinct you might have, descended into the sealed smoking room for a cigarette and a drink, separated from 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen by an airlock and the iron discipline of the stewards. It was, for 2.5 days, the most civilized journey on Earth. But the ship was running late. Strong headwinds over the Atlantic had slowed her, putting her about half a day behind schedule. And as she finally approached the New Jersey coast on the afternoon of May the 6th, the weather at Lakehurst was poor. Rain, gusting wind, and thunderstorms in the area. Captain Pruss, wisely, attempted to land into the bad weather. He took the great ship out over the coast, and the bay to wait, cruising in slow circles, letting the worst of the storms pass upon you. It was early evening before the field finally signaled that conditions had improved enough to attempt a landing. The Hindenburg turned and began her final approach to the mooring mast at Lakehurst Naval Air Station. The delay would prove to be one of the small, fateful links in the chain, because it meant she came in to land through air, still charged and wet from the passing storm. It was just after 7 in the evening when the Hindenburg nosed in over the field. Below her, hundreds of people waited. A ground crew of more than 200 men needed to wrestle a ship this size to the mast, alongside reporters, photographers, newsreel crews, and the radio announcer Herbert Morrison, there to record what everyone expected to be a routine arrival. Captain Pruss brought her in high. then valved gas and dropped water ballast to bring her gently down toward mooring height, about 200 feet above the ground. At 7:21, the forward mooring lines were dropped from the bow and snaked down to the waiting crew. Men on the ground took hold and began the slow work of walking the giant down. Cameras rolled. It was, for those last few seconds, exactly the picture-perfect arrival everyone had come to see. And then, at 7:25 in the evening, witnesses saw it. A small flicker of flame, or a faint blue glow, near the top of the hull toward the tail, just ahead of the upper tail fin. For perhaps a second, it was small, almost nothing, and then the hydrogen found it. What happened next happened faster than the human mind can truly follow. The flame touched leaking hydrogen, and the rear gas cells ignited. A vast gout of fire erupted from the top and tail of the ship, billowing upward in a mushroom of orange flame. The tail dropped as the rear cells burned away and lost their lift, and the great ship sagged backward, her nose pitching up into the sky. Inside, fire raced forward through the ship, along the line of the gas cells, cell after cell exploding into flame. The beautiful, doped skin caught and burned. In the control car and the passenger decks, people had perhaps 10, 15, 20 seconds, no more, to understand that the impossible was happening and to decide in an instant whether to leap or to burn. Down on the ground, Herbert Morrison was still speaking into his recorder, mid-sentence, scribing the mooring, and the recording captures in real time the exact moment a calm man watches the unthinkable. His voice climbs from routine description into pure anguish. "It's burst into flames," he cries. "Get out of the way. This is terrible. It's burning, bursting into flames, and is falling." And then the words that have echoed for nearly a century, his voice breaking completely. "Oh, the humanity!" And all the passengers screaming around here. He was so overcome he had to stop. It remains, to this day, one of the most harrowing pieces of audio ever recorded. From the first flicker to the moment, the burning skeleton settled onto the field, broken and glowing, about 32 seconds. 32 seconds to destroy the largest flying machine ever built. The crowd on the ground, who a heartbeat earlier had been waving, now ran for their lives as the flaming wreck crashed down toward them. And here is the part of the Hindenburg story that almost no one remembers. The part the famous footage hides. Most of the people aboard survived. Of the 97 people on the Hindenburg, 62 lived. Think about that against what you have just pictured. A ship filled with hydrogen, consumed by fire in half a minute, 200 feet in the air, and nearly 2 out of every 3 people aboard walked, ran, leapt, or were dragged out alive. How? Partly because of how the ship fell. As the tail sagged and the ship settled, the passenger decks, for a few crucial seconds, came close enough to the ground that people could jump. And many did, leaping from windows 10, 20, 30 feet up, some with their clothes on fire, into the arms of the very ground crew, who instead of fleeing, ran toward the inferno to pull survivors out. The fire, fed by hydrogen, burned upward and outward, away from the gondola where the people were, rather than engulfing them all at once. And hydrogen, for all its terrible flammability, burns fast and rises fast. The worst of the heat went up, not down. The survivors' accounts are almost beyond belief. Passengers described a sudden brightness, a strange shudder, and then the floor tilting wildly beneath them as the tail dropped. Some were thrown against walls. Some watched the fire racing toward them down the length of the ship, and simply waited at an open window for the ground to come close enough. One passenger recalled standing at the promenade window, feeling the heat at his back, and jumping the instant the hull swung near the earth, landing, rolling, and running. While behind him the ship he had crossed an ocean collapsed into a glowing cage of red-hot metal. Stewards pushed passengers out of windows to save them. Crewmen deep inside the burning hull crawled along catwalks through the flames. That so many made it out in so few seconds is, by any measure, close to a miracle, and a testament to the people on the ground who refused to run. Still, the cost was horrific. 35 of the 97 aboard died, 13 passengers and 22 crew, many of them caught in the falling, burning structure, or killed by the flames, or by the leap itself. And on the ground, one member of the American Navy ground crew, a man named Alan Hageman, could not get clear in time and was killed by the falling wreck, bringing the toll to 36. Among the dead was Captain Ernst Lehmann, great airship commander, who walked out of the wreckage terribly burned and died the next day. Captain Pruss, the man at the controls, survived, though badly burned, having gone back into the flames to search for survivors. 14-year-old cabin boy lived, soaked, and saved by water ballast that burst over him. Every survivor carried that evening with them for the rest of their lives. And so, as the embers cooled on that New Jersey field, the world demanded the same answer it always demands. Why? What had turned the safest way to fly, with its 30-year spotless record, into a fireball in 32 seconds? Both German and American investigators descended on Lakehurst, and here is the remarkable thing. Nearly 90 years later, we still cannot say with absolute certainty exactly what happened, but we can build a chain, and almost all of the evidence points one way. Start with the two things that must both be true for a hydrogen fire. You need leaking hydrogen mixed with air, and you need a spark to light it. The investigation and the decades of analysis since have focused on finding both. On the leak, the leading theory holds that one of the rear gas cells had developed a leak, perhaps from a structural failure, a snapped bracing wire that punctured a cell, or a stuck valve, allowing hydrogen to seep up and collect in the upper rear part of the hull. That would explain precisely where the fire was first seen, high and toward the tail. Now the sparks. And this is where the weather that delayed the landing comes back to matter. The Hindenburg had flown in through air, still electrically charged from the passing thunderstorms, and her surface was wet with rain. When the wet mooring lines touched the ground, they effectively earthed the ship's metal framework. But the outer skin, the doped fabric cover, may not have been at the same electrical charge. The leading explanation, supported by experiments, is that this difference in electrical potential produced a spark, a discharge of static electricity, arcing across a gap in the structure, right in the region where hydrogen was leaking. Leaking hydrogen, a static spark in the rain. That is the most widely accepted cause. Not sabotage, not a bomb, but static electricity, igniting a hydrogen leak on a ship that should have been filled with helium. There have been other theories, and they are worth knowing. One, advanced by a former NASA scientist named Addison Bain, argued that the real culprit was the ship's skin itself, that the doping compound painted onto the fabric was so flammable, mixture, rich in compounds chemically similar to rocket fuel, that a spark could have set the cover alight even before the hydrogen took over. It is a fascinating idea, and the paint certainly did burn, but other physicists pushed back hard, calculating that the paint alone would have taken not 32 seconds, but many hours to consume the ship. The speed of the disaster, they argued, could only be explained by hydrogen, and there was from the very beginning a theory of sabotage. A bomb planted by someone opposed to the Nazi regime, the ship so proudly represented. It made for gripping headlines. But no credible evidence of a bomb was ever found, and most serious historians have long dismissed it. So strip it all back, and the verdict is sobering in its simplicity. The Hindenburg most likely died because she was filled with a gas that should never have been carrying passengers. A flammable gas she was only carrying because the safe alternative had been denied to her, and because, on a wet and electrically charged evening, a tiny spark found a leak. The fault was not really one person or one mistake. The fault, as with so many great disasters, was built into the machine itself years before, by a chain of compromises and politics and bad luck. The hydrogen was the loaded gun. The storm pulled the trigger. The Hindenburg disaster killed 36 people. By the grim arithmetic of aviation, that is not, in fact, an enormous number. Far worse crashes were to come. And yet the Hindenburg did something no other disaster of its time came close to doing. It ended an entire era of flight, almost overnight. Why? Because of the cameras. This was the first true mass media disaster. The newsreel film of the Hindenburg erupting into flame played in cinemas around the world within days. The photographs were on the front page of every newspaper by the next morning, and Herbert Morrison's shattering broadcast. Oh, the humanity carried the raw human horror of it straight into people's ears. For the first time in history, the public did not merely read that a disaster had happened. They saw it. They heard a grown man weep, as he described it. And the image of that beautiful silver giant turning into a falling torch burned itself into the mind of the entire world. No one who saw it would ever again step willingly aboard a hydrogen airship. Public confidence in airship travel did not decline. It vanished instantly. Bookings collapsed. The remaining German airships were grounded, and before long, went up for scrap. Their metal fed into the coming war. The grand dream of the floating ocean liners of the sky, of crossing the Atlantic in a flying palace, was over, killed in 32 seconds on a field in New Jersey. Here is the deeper truth, the one that makes the Hindenburg more than just a spectacular fire. The age of the airship was already dying, even before Lakehurst. Because while the Zeppelins drifted along at 80 miles an hour, dependent on the weather, vast and slow and fragile, the airplane had been quietly, relentlessly getting better. In 1936, the very year the Hindenburg entered service, a new airplane called the Douglas DC-3 began to transform air travel faster and cheaper and more practical than any airship could ever be. Within a few years, airplanes would cross the Atlantic routinely. The airship was a magnificent dead end, a beautiful answer to a question the airplane was about to answer better. The Hindenburg did not so much end the future of the airship as revealed, in a single blaze of fire, that it had never really had one, and there is a final irony worth sitting with. The thing that doomed the Hindenburg was not in the end bad engineering, it was politics. Had the United States simply sold Germany the helium it asked for, the Hindenburg would in all likelihood have flown for years more, and the fire that ended the airship age would never have started. The safe gas existed. It was sitting in tanks in Texas. It was withheld for reasons of war and suspicion, and so a passenger ship was filled with a gas everyone knew could burn. To this day, helium remains rare and strategically precious, and the few airships that still float over us now, the advertising blimps and the occasional experimental craft, are filled, always, with that safe and inert gas. The lesson of Lakehurst was learned, permanently, in a single evening. You do not lift human beings into the sky on a bubble of fire if there is any way on Earth to avoid it. People have tried, again and again across the decades, to bring the great airship back, to revive the romance of the gentle giant, the cruise ship of the clouds. Every so often, a new company promises that the age of the airship is about to return. It never quite does. And the reason is always, in part, the ghost of the Hindenburg, that 32 seconds of film that no amount of engineering can erase from the human memory. One disaster, witnessed by the whole world, was enough to close a door that has never fully reopened, and so the safest way to fly became, in 32 seconds, a symbol of disaster for all time, while the airplane, very machine that had killed its first man at Fort Myer just 30 years earlier, flew on to inherit the sky. There is a strange and humbling lesson in that. The technology that looks like the future is not always the one that wins. Sometimes the future belongs to the machine that is still rough, still dangerous, still learning from its dead, but capable, in the end, of becoming something the magnificent giant never could. 36 people died beneath the swastikas on that wet New Jersey evening. The largest flying machine ever built fell burning out of the sky in front of the whole watching world, and an entire vision of human flight, the floating palace, the gentle giant of the air, died with them so completely that today the very idea sounds like a fantasy. All of it undone by the lightest element in the universe and a single spark in the rain. The Hindenburg is remembered not because it was the deadliest disaster in the sky. It was far from it, but because it was the first one the whole world watched happen together in real time, taught a generation to fear the sky, and it cleared the way in its fall for the airplane to claim the future. On this channel, we are following that future, one disaster at a time. Every crash that shaped how we fly, why we now fly so safely. If this story moved you, subscribe and tell me in the comments which disaster I should take you inside next. I read every one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.